Thank you. I am the unicorn in the room. There is no doubt about that. Let me see if I can grab the slide changer here. I'm going to, even though I am short, I can't talk about loneliness and be separated from all of you somehow or another. So I'm going to come down here if that's okay with you. I have had not a change of heart. I have been working with the pharma industry for many, many years now in helping with drug development and helping try to treat patients who already have a disease to a great extent. But it has recently, of course, come to my attention, like so many of you as well, I'm quite sure that there's a whole lot more to what we do than simply treating disease that's already there. And as our world is very rapidly changing, all kinds of things going on that we'll get to in a moment, it's really become a real passion of mine to think about what loneliness might be in terms of an impact on our lives. And as I hear you all and heard you all this morning, clearly there is something that's connecting a lot of these things. So what I'm going to do now is shift gears just for a moment from the brain, probably as much to the heart and the gut as what you felt in a while. So I'm going to do that with your permission, and I hope this works for you. There's a lot of research out there. I'm going to choose not to share a lot of it right now because you've had a lot of that already this morning. But I want to take you on a little journey. It's called a journey of loneliness. Recent meta-analysis was just published. And that meta-analysis, and it was a big one, and it came out of Brigham Young, but they did a lot of research over a number of years looking at loneliness as an actual teased apart variable. And this is an actual quote from their publication, that loneliness may be a more significant health factor than obesity, smoking, exercise, or nutrition. Now, as again, we think about the way we normally treat disease, that word treat is a real important piece. What I want to do again, and what this conference is doing, and I think that's why I'm so excited to be here. I can't tell you how excited I was when Zan asked me, because to me this looks at, for the first time, a group coming together in a collaborative way to think about not only how to treat some of these outcomes of what I might call loneliness and other things, but also perhaps how to prevent it. And I think with that is one reason Zan asked me to come. So as we think about then loneliness, and I said a little bit of a different situation here for the afternoon, I think it is a very startling number, and it runs very parallel to the recent or the impact of obesity. I think I heard about 30% of American adults were obese earlier this morning. What I can tell you is according to the UCLA loneliness scale, which to my knowledge is the only validated scale on loneliness, 35% of Americans say they are chronically lonely. Okay, now there are a whole lot of folks in this room who know a whole lot more about the physiological response to that than do I, perhaps. But I do believe that something like cortisol is released when one gets lonely, and especially over a long period of time. What I've heard this morning is I think about a potential umbrella for a lot of the things we talk about, and kind of a potential why we may have seen things recently go up. And part of it is age. As we said this morning, the demographics are changing, and earlier this afternoon. But part of it also is a huge change in culture and in drivers that are going on around us in our world, none the least of which we'll talk about in a moment. Here's the thing. There's a study that came out in the 1970s, and I'm just going to share this with you to show the power of loneliness. And some of you may know what I mean. Just look around you. 1 of 3 at your table is chronically lonely as we speak today. And the impacts are pretty devastating for some people with that chronic loneliness. The study they did in the 1970s, and this was out of Canada, looked at rats, and they actually called it a rat park. I mean, I've never seen a rat resort or whatever, but apparently it was something in that neighborhood. And they put some rats individually in individual cages. And they gave them the choice between plain water and water laced with morphine. It didn't take those lonely rats very long to figure out which one they wanted. Okay, and it certainly was not the plain water. Interestingly, when they added to the cage another rat, i.e. created a family, or relationship as we might call it somehow, I guess that's a little higher level than the fruit flies. Is that right? Okay. when they added them in, an amazing thing happened, in that the rats who had been then self-selecting for morphine, guess what happened, guys? Very, very quickly, those same rats no longer self-selected for the morphine. Now, whether or not we all buy that as the definitive science as to how it worked, and in fact, they've tried to replicate that study in all honesty, and sometimes they've been able to replicate it, and sometimes they've come up with different results. But either way, however one perceives the weakness or the strengths of the studies, it helps illustrate the power of loneliness for all of us. So we don't really need to be rats in a cage. What do we need as human beings? What we know is we need relationships, ones that give us the ability to actually feel comfortable sharing something about how we feel with someone else in a safe environment. So one might ask, how in the world do I define loneliness? There's a whole bunch of different definitions, of course, out there, one of which is here. Often defined as a distressing feeling generated by a lack of meaningful, intimate, and reciprocal relationships. One might describe it as emotional isolation. Now, I want to be very careful here. Just because you're alone does not mean you're lonely. Okay, you can be in a New York City with 8 million folks and be just deathly lonely. Or you can be very soon at Thanksgiving dinner in the United States with your whole family around you and still be lonely. Or you can be all by yourself and not be lonely at all. It's how you react to the feeling around you. So I kind of like to set up this better. I like to say that loneliness is something unique for each of us, how we need and what we need. And the real definition of loneliness is that gap between what you need as an individual to fulfill your relationship's needs and what's reality for you. Because my need might be I just need 1 or 2 friends with whom I can share. Yours might be that you need to be on a football team somewhere with a whole bunch of guys, and that community feels yours. But one way or another, if there is a gap and the gap's too big, you're going to feel lonely, and it will have an impact on our lives. If you read the headlines right now in the United States, and I haven't had a chance to read them in the UK, but I know the UK has been looking at loneliness, especially in their OAPs and others for a good while, and you've actually given more attention to it than we have in the United States for sure. But if you look recently at the headlines in the US, they're full of things. Forbes magazine ran a headline, "Loneliness, the current health care epidemic in the United States." There are headlines everywhere. It's kind of become the thing to talk about, up to and including a decrease in productivity in the US. So why now? What in the world is happening in the last 20 years to cause this increase in loneliness? Whole bunch of things. Excessive social media use. Anybody see the 2-year-olds, just can't get away from their gaming or their iPads or whatever it is? They're not necessarily learning the same social skills that we might in the future. Decreased organizational memberships, fewer and delayed marriages and partnerships, increased working from home, and even those who are at work. We're not creating the same kind of work communities that we used to. A surging senior population, which you've already talked about a lot this morning clearly, limited outside play and experience with nature, reduced time to build meaningful relationships, and it goes on and on and on. So now is the time we have to come up with interventions. Talked about some today. We talked about educating our young people sooner in terms of food and how we eat and how that's programmed earlier. How about those relationships and how we build them with other people around us in a world of social media and disconnect? What kind of modeling do we do? How do we teach our physicians to ask about relationship health at the same time they ask about all the other health? We have to create, in essence, a new paradigm for what socialization and relationship skills look like in the future. That train, guys, is out of the station. And what you see in the old days in our coffee shops with people talking with one another now becomes Starbucks with the earbuds in. Know what I mean? And folks aren't then sharing or learning. So what are our implications of health? Well, clearly, academic research and an onslaught of headline news reveal loneliness is a leading driver for suicide, addiction, bullying, and now we get to some of our metabolic issues we're talking about now. Obesity, GI disease, metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, hematologic, and we'll add oncology as well. We just were talking about that this morning and today. All of these things, and here's my question to you. Do we treat all the symptoms, or do we see if there is something that connects these somehow and try to treat as much as we can the actual cause of as many of these? And trust me, when I say the actual cause, I was one of those 5 audacious people who raised my hand when Richard asked this morning, does anybody have an answer? Actually, mine was the second one. Does anybody have a piece of the answer, I think? I think I do have a piece of the answer here, and it's not me. There are a lot of people a whole lot smarter than I am who figured this out clearly. But I do think it is important, just as it's important to treat and prevent smoking if we can, because that causes COPD. What can we do to mitigate loneliness, which might help with all the other things we've been talking about today? If we look at loneliness, obesity, and type 2 diabetes, just as a quick example, there's been an 85% increase, and I don't need to tell you guys, but in the economic costs of type 2 diabetes in the United States alone, in 6 years. 85% increase. From $322 billion to 174 in 2007 to 322 billion in 2013. And that doesn't even look at the human costs. What does it mean to the people who have diabetes, which is one reason we're all here? How do they feel? We talked about quality of life a bit this morning. What does that do to them in addition to the actual dollars that are paid from a societal standpoint? Clearly, 30 million Americans have diabetes. I do not know what it is in the UK, but clearly a very high percentage as well, and it's only going to grow. Now, here's the thing. Everybody in this room, because I've been listening to it all day long, understands this cortisol cycle and understands the release of sugar and what it does in our bodies. What I just want to make sure everybody really gets, though, is there is a key piece here that helps release the cortisol that we need to be very thoughtful about. Anybody know anything about stress? Do you guys ever feel that? Hello. Some of you are getting ready to speak after I am. You probably feel a little stressed right now as it goes, but all of us do. We're not going to change the stress. So what we have to do is figure out a way to cope with that stress better. As you guys know, chronic stress releases cortisol in your body, and we just talked about sugars increase as well. When you're stressed and you have inflammation clearly from that, there is a metabolic impact. So the question I have for the group, if we could reduce the stress by decreasing the loneliness, in other words, by having those relationships help support us in times of stress so that our stress is lessened and not as chronic, might we prevent some of the things that we're talking about today? It's gaining a lot of momentum in the press these days, and there's a lot of research going on at UCLA, at Chicago University, all kinds of different places looking at this. But I just want to make sure we all understand as well. Think about this. If you're lonely and you have to fill the void somehow, what do? You're sitting at home, you're watching the telly. Anybody ever go to the pantry or the refrigerator? I know we're supposed to reduce our caloric intake. I got that message this morning. But think about, you come home, you're stressed out, you're by yourself, you eat that pint of ice cream. Tomorrow night is 2 pints. What's that called? Comfort food. Why do you think it's called comfort food? So it makes us feel better inside, and guess what? It's usually carbohydrates and sugar. Okay? As we then begin to do that, and as that begins, now I'm using food, but you can use drugs, you could use alcohol. 1 in 12 adult Americans now are alcoholics. That would be by percentage a fairly good number sitting in this room today. Because what happens as a beginning or a start can certainly then become binging, which could turn to addiction, all the way thinking about food, opioids, all kinds of things. And unfortunately, the rate of suicide is also increasing dramatically as a great result of all of this. So lots happening. In fact, according to a study out of the University of Chicago, loneliness as an independent variable when controlling for as many of the others as humanly possible increases the risk of premature death by 26%. So what are the current costs? We can measure the cost to a great extent for society in terms of dollars. What we were talking about a few minutes ago, or just a minute ago, about the ice cream piece, you can't really measure. Those costs are immeasurable to the individual and their families and all the things that go on as a result of the diseases we've been talking about today, and bullying, and suicide, and all of the other things that loneliness may cause. But let's just look at some of the others. We've already looked at a lot of the ones that we've been talking about, but just to give you a feel of the impact that this loneliness can have, suicide costs the U.S. approximately $51 billion annually. Substance abuse costs the U.S. approximately $700 billion annually. Major depressive disorder, suicide, and addiction taken together costs $960 billion a year. We can attach real dollars to those, and that's just one country, guys. That doesn't take into account all the rest of the world. When you start looking at those actual costs to society, think what we could do in terms of research for our drug products, for the things that you guys might want to do that can actually help. And again, loneliness is one piece of a much bigger picture. There's never going to be anybody standing here telling you loneliness is the only answer. It's not. I didn't come about this passion just for the heck of it. Frankly, I'm just like you guys. I'm data-driven. And I actually came out of sales and marketing at Bristol-Myers Squibb. I'd be the last person you think was standing here talking to you about loneliness. Okay? But when I started seeing the impact it was remarkable to me in terms of the opportunities we have to pay attention to this now and change our world in the future. This train is out of the station. If we don't figure out how to create relationships that work in our new future, our whole health as a society, a global society, will be at risk. So what do we have to do now? I think we have to think loneliness first. You guys remember, many of you went to medical school, right? How many went to medical school here? Many of you? Remember when you were told think horses, not zebras, or zebras, depending on where you were trained? It's real important for us to also remember that a lot of the things we deal with, frankly, may actually be right in front of our eyes. Maybe something that actually is happening in our own homes and our own lives. And I know some of you know personally what I'm talking about right now. You've experienced this to some degree or another, or someone in your family has, if 1 out of 3 is correct. So think loneliness first. Make sure, if you're seeing patients, as an example, who are already overweight, who already have diabetes, what might actually be causing them to be that way? It may be a socioeconomic condition. It could be that they don't have access to the food. It could be they were trained to eat the wrong food from the time they were little. It also could be because they're lonely. And believe me, loneliness is not, let me just say, everybody can be that. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, educated or uneducated. Any of those things, it can attract and attack everybody. So think loneliness first. Tell the story that you're hearing now. One of the things we have to do is destigmatize loneliness. Lily and others helped do a wonderful job about that, I think, for depression, and helped everybody understand that depression was something that we could talk about. We had to talk about. And we had to not only treat it, but folks had to come forward and say, something's wrong with me. It's the same thing here. Folks won't look at you generally and say, I'm lonely. Because, hey, guess what? They might feel like they're weird, or somebody doesn't love them, or whatever it may be. Somehow or another, we have to tell the story, and we have to help destigmatize what's going on out there with loneliness. And lastly, when I say join us in the Cost of Loneliness Project, I'm spending a lot of my time, not all my time, I'm still doing my other work, but a lot of my time now I'm dedicating to trying to help raise awareness about loneliness, but also bring together groups just like this to begin thinking about how we reprogram ourselves for the future in terms of city design, in terms of architecture, as folks move back into the cities. What does that mean to us? How can we create the new communities of the future? The small villages of 100 like we used to have when everybody had a purpose and everybody worked together and felt much more together. So in that Cost of Loneliness project, and I have the website up there, we'd love to have you. If you have ideas, is what I'm saying, please share them. If you have folks that you know who are interested in helping reduce loneliness in our world, I'd love to hear from you. And especially if any of you feel like it may be important to you to be a part of something like this, to help try to connect the dots. As I don't know if any of you watch TED Talks, or listen to TED Talks either, but Simon Sinek had the largest one ever listened to in the world, and his was about the why. I believe there's something to this loneliness piece in terms of the why. So please join us if you will. And I leave you with this slide. You can read it for yourself, but I'm going to read it for you. We live in a society bloated with data, yet starved for wisdom. We're connected 24/7, yet anxiety, fear, depression, and loneliness is at an all-time high. We must course correct. I believe not only do we have to course correct, but now's the time to take that deep collective pause and say, with all the cool things that's going on around us so fast, all the technology, everything that's happening, all the fun things that we play with and our toys and the change in how we interact with one another. Now's the time to figure out where's that taking us, just like with artificial intelligence and robotics and all those others. The time to do that is before we find ourselves in a place that's too painful. So I believe now's the time, and I believe in thinking about the cost of loneliness to the individuals and to all of our societies as a whole. We can't afford not to. Thank you very, very much.
Any comments or questions? Nir?
Please, I hope. I love those. Now it can actually be fun and have fun for you.
Well, we may have different definitions of the word fun, but okay.
Yes.
As long as you're not lonely.
In this group, I hope I'm not. That's for sure.
As you were talking, I was thinking
Yes.
of this joke, which is two fish are talking to each other. One of the fish says, "How's the water?" And the other fish says, "What's water?" Because we're sort of in this environment that we exist in
Yes.
without being really cognizant about it, and are subjected to it without really thinking much, having much awareness of it. And I'm thinking about loneliness as, in the societal context, at least in the United States, where a progressive drive to turn everyone into their individual actors without any responsibility to each other and without expectation of connection to one another. And my question is, whose job is that to change it? It's not. I can tell you our current administration would not see this as their job.
Hence why I see it kind of as ours, collectively. Because I certainly agree with you. I don't think this is going to be on the top 10 hits right now in our current administration. And it's not the top 10 hits probably right now in a lot of places, considering what's going on in the political world. But I do believe that it is something that must happen, and it must happen now, not later, because if we don't pay attention to it now, it's kind of like when you build a startup company. The time to build the structure is when? Before your drug gets approved. Once it's already approved, it's kind of too late to say, ooh, let's go back and set that process in place. Yikes. It's very similar to that now. So I don't know who it is unless it's folks like us. And that's one reason that I've started this project, because I think we have to have our voice out there, and we have to take that pause now and bring people together to make this work. But that's all I know. I don't see anybody else at this very moment collectively doing this, and I really give kudos to Zan, because this is kind of a beginning of thinking of a whole piece as to how we deal with a lot of these things.
So can you also say, you also exemplify the problems
Yes.
of saying, you can be lonely in Thanksgiving meal, right? So how, and you said there's apparently an instrument out of UCLA that can define loneliness. So how can you objectively define loneliness, give it a scale, so actually you can translate everything you said to a new, real data, connect the longevity to the risks?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we have to collectively, I think, as a new family, think about in a broader sense is how do we put data around some of this? What research is needed? How do we begin to connect some of these dots? And just like you all were talking about research about everything else, it's a challenge to do this, though there are a number of universities and centers around the country and around the world actually doing research now on this. But it is, at the end of the day, a very unique definition for each of us. What makes me lonely, I traveled, I'll just put it out there. I have 8 million Marriott points, yeehaw, 8 million. 2,500 nights in Marriotts all by myself. That's a lot of time on the road and a whole lot of lonely stuff going on there, as you might imagine. But how I define loneliness for me is going to be different than you do for you, and that's what makes this kind of hard. So that validated scale, the UCLA one, probably needs some relook right now, though I am hearing that from psychiatrists and others who thinks maybe we need to update that in terms of how we do it. But it is very unique at the end of the day, and I think that's why trying to make this an important part of a natural conversation is important for each of us to look inside us and see what we need.
As I walk over to
Yes, sir.
hand the microphone to the next person to ask the question, I just remember when I grew up, my father had a neighborhood pharmacy. And when people would come in to get their medicine, he would talk to them personally. Now, a type 2 diabetic is going to get their medicines perhaps by mail order, or they'll walk into the big box pharmacy and they'll wait online like a robot, and they'll fill out various things on the screen and stick their card in, and then they're done. There's not any contact in many aspects of the society. So I think that it's an issue that has to be publicized. And that reminds me of another point. Even in the science involving Drosophila, Teresa said something very cool. One of the experiments she showed was done at the Museum of Natural History.
Yes.
You've got to get messages out, both your message and Teresa's message. So the people in this meeting are highly articulate. That's one of the reasons you're here. But I think a number of projects can emanate from this meeting. We should discuss it at the coffee break and other times. But before I filibuster, please.
Thank you very much for your thoughts and comments. And that is a real issue. This is very big, clearly. Thank you. Yes.
Hi. I'm from a background of public health. What you have done, you've opened the floodgates.
I know.
And I say that because I think that one of the questions that we need to address is, this is not a single professional challenge. This is a challenge for society. And there are a large number of other aspects of this. Loneliness has different meaning for people from different cultural backgrounds. And if we are going to look at loneliness as a general idea, we're going to miss it. Loneliness is going to, the way that I personally see it is that we're going to have to begin involving a broad variety of people from different professional backgrounds. It happens to be the social worker, the economist. It's going to have to also, a lot of the examples that you raised are things that at a governmental level are going to have a policy implication. And I'm just thinking about a problem that I see very frequently. When my grandchildren come and they can sit with us looking at this terrible instrument, not being willing to talk to anybody, their parents are no longer capable of changing this, and yet you've indicated, and I think there's a lot in it, that within the next 10 to 15, 20 years, these people are going to be incapable of communicating with other people. And therefore, I think that you've raised an issue that is something far beyond whether it just happens to be obesity, diabetes, and something else. We are talking about something that's going to have its implications at a societal health level that is going to require a very broad outlook on things. And how this is going to be done, well, I'd like to hear how you think it's going to be done.
Thank you. I do have a mic here, so I'll let you keep that one. Just in case I say anything wrong, you can course correct. Boy, I wish I had all the answers. I don't. I'm just, a human being out here trying to do my best to begin to raise awareness and begin to put a coalition of folks together exactly to your point. This project that I've identified, people always have accused me of thinking way bigger than, I should probably to try to deal with this, and why not deal with a little narrow piece? But I hear you loud and clear. To me, it's too big to try to just deal with a little narrow piece. We're going to try to do two things and kind of two approaches at this point. One is to try to do a lot of PR and publicity to the people all over the world, but certainly in the US now because that's where I'm based, to try to help raise awareness and try to help destigmatize loneliness. So folks do understand that it is a real issue and it's one that impacts their lives, not just something that somebody says, oh, it's okay, you'll feel better tomorrow. So that's just not always the case. And we're taught, of course, buck up, be tough, you can handle this. And so part of it is raising awareness, and the other part is forming that coalition. It is beginning to bring people together in large meetings and in smaller salons, everybody from architects to city planners to healthcare providers to sociologists to economists, all these people to begin to put their great brains together and try to figure out where we go from here. Because it is a huge, to your point, a huge impact on all of the things we're talking about today. So our next goal is to have that first one of those smaller groups in February. But I do have information, if anybody wanted, I did bring at least what we're thinking with me, and I'd be happy to share it with you. We can continue to vamp if we don't have someone else coming right behind me. I'm more than happy to facilitate any discussion anybody would like.
Sam, do you have any last comments?
I really thank you all for listening. I know this is a very different approach than what you all had been hearing all day, so thank you for your attention.
Lucy, could I ask you to comment on one aspect? When I put the numbers up about densification of societies, I think we're going to see a combination of loneliness, but also of people becoming more identified with smaller and smaller groups with which they relate. In the rural environment, everybody was dependent on each other to raise the barn when it burned, or to build the schoolhouse, or there was just this implied what it meant to be a citizen. It's hard for me to see how we are going to expect the same level of that kind of participation in these very dense environments, which is going to not only lead to loneliness, but lead to further and further narrowing of this identity politics, which is a pluralistic nightmare. So would you comment on that and what you've seen in your work?
I'll be delighted to try because, if we go back to very early times, the average village, the villages were about 100 people, hence the kind of concept of it takes a village. They were small, but they were very supportive, and usually folks were either kin to one another or very close friends. And in fact, once a village got to be 100 people or thereabouts, where not everybody had a purpose anymore, or folks were far enough apart that they really weren't as supportive, the villages fragmented and another village formed of about 100 people, and the same kind of thing happened. So you're absolutely right, and that has been the case. You can look at Italy today and how they're selling even those smaller, older villages to different groups to become small villages again. You're seeing movements in the US where families and good friends are buying mountaintops and moving and living there together, almost back to the communal kind of living that we remember from the 1700s. But I think we have to figure that out. I don't have the answers yet. I think we do have to think about, though, and that's why I keep saying architects and city planners, but also the folks who run volunteer organizations, the folks who have community gardens. How do we find like purpose If you look at the Scandinavian countries as an example of the happiest countries in the world, and Bhutan is thrown in there as well, but generally it's the Scandinavian countries, when they look at where the Venn diagram kind of comes together, what they usually see is that those folks in Scandinavia, and those are the happiest, are the ones who do come together in groups. And they might be a member of 10 different clubs, everything from photography clubs to book clubs to dinner clubs to fishing clubs, whatever it may be, but they're supporting one another and they've built that trust because it's a small group. How we go about that in the future with everything changing as we are is a discussion we have to have. How do we build that opportunity for folks to be supportive of one another? And that's why, for me, I don't have all the answers yet, and I'll be the first to say. But I would hope that I can help convene and catalyze, or maybe we can, as a group, folks to begin to really think about this, because I think it will have a giant impact on the work all of you all do as well. You just can't deny the role stress plays, as an example, in eating behaviors and in addiction and all the other things that we talk about.
Well, Lucy, you clearly captured the imagination of the audience here, and you actually filled in some time that we were missing, and we're right on schedule.
I could have gone right on, but
yeah, well,
thank you.
This was absolutely terrific.
Thank
we
you.
are going to continue with Larry's session after the coffee break, but we do have a break now, and we'll come back in about 20 minutes.
Okay, thank you all so very, very much. Thank you.